Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar titled An Overview of Allegheny County's Eviction Analysis. To let you know, this presentation is being recorded and will run approximately 60 minutes, including a couple minutes for question and answer. Additionally, please note that the information in the chat feature does get saved. We will send you a link to this webinar via email and the recording and any accompanying materials within the next few days, as well as upload it to our YouTube channel and post it on our website. Attendees will be muted during the presentation. If you have questions for the presenters, please type them in the Q&A box in the bottom of your screen. If you have a logistical question and need help from myself or other Housing Alliance staff, please use the chat feature. Please do not use the chat feature for questions for the presenters. I'll now turn it over to Gail Schwartz to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Stacy, and thank you all for joining us today. Really excited to have our presenter with us, Rachel Rue, who in the past has been a philosophy professor and a street musician and a tutor, but for recent years has been working as a public policy analyst, formerly at the Rand Institute and currently at the Allegheny County Department of Human Services, and has been doing some really interesting research around eviction in Allegheny County, and really has some strategies and methodologies that can be adopted anywhere in Pennsylvania. I think in thinking about eviction, one of the biggest challenges in eviction historically really is it's a hard, complex problem to measure. It really wasn't until a few years ago with Matthew Desmond, first with his book Evicted, and then following up with the Eviction Lab report that really gave us the first kind of broad scale, easily accessible eviction related data for states, that we really were able to take the data to match it to what so many of us working in the housing crisis sector have known to be true about the scale of the problem, and really needing to get the better data to start to drive better policy. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Rachel, who is going to start sharing her screen and give us an overview of what she learned about eviction in Allegheny County, how she was able to get to those conclusions, and what this is telling us about eviction that we should take into consideration going forward, especially as we are negotiating not only the eviction crisis prior to the pandemic, but what does this mean going forward during the pandemic, as well as afterwards, and really thinking about what are the better solutions that can meet the needs of tenants, landlords, and the community as a whole. So, Rachel?
Okay. And can you see the screen?
We are good to go.
Great. Okay, hello everybody. So this is a presentation based on findings from a report that we put out in October. This is joint work with Michael Jonas of the Pittsburgh Foundation. I put two links here. The first one will take you to the full report. The second one will take you to a step-by-step guide to the legal process that describes every single step, and there are links in there that will bring up the text of the law or the court rule governing each step. I'm putting that there because I found myself that it was incredibly liberating when I learned that I could actually read and understand the court rules so that the legal process isn't mysterious. So what I'm going to do, at Gail's request, I'm first going to present findings from the report, but then once I've done that, I'm actually going to spend a little time talking about what the data sources are and what's in them, what's not in them, and how you can get access to them, and also which ones are easy to get access to and which ones are more complicated. And Part 3 is actually not a section of the report, but in each of the findings slides in the notes section, when this gets distributed, you'll find brief notes that explain what the source is for each slide and how much effort is required to do the analysis necessary for it. So first, the findings from the report. This is based on all the data that we could get from the magisterial district courts, which is apart from Philadelphia, where cases are first filed, in Pennsylvania, and it's the last 8 years worth of data. First, the scale. So in Allegheny County, and every year, there are somewhere between 13 and 14,000 cases filed. That's very, very consistent. There's a little bit of up and down every year, but it's not very much. It's been very, very stable before COVID. This year, of course, that number is way down, and we expect starting January 1st, unless there's an extension of the moratorium, there will be a lot of cases coming into the courts. The amount of money involved, unlike the number of cases, has been going up and up and up every single year. So looking at the average dollar amount claimed by landlords, so that means what they say they're owed when they come to court. That doesn't have anything to do with the court costs, the filing fees, the attorney fees, just what landlords say they're owed for back rent or damages or whatever else, and most of it is back rent. That amount has been going up. The average amount has gone up 35%. The median amount has gone up 37%. Last year, the average amount was a little over $2,000 per claim, and median was lower, $1,645. So why is that? Most people, if you ask them why they think that would be happening, will immediately say, especially if they live in Allegheny County, rents are going up. Everything's more expensive. Of course, the amount of money involved is going up. And that is true. Rents in Allegheny County are going up, but they are not going up nearly as fast as the amount of money involved in eviction cases. So let me just focus on the graph here for a minute. The blue line in the middle, all three of these lines represent the increase from a 2012 baseline. So that blue line shows the increase in the median claim amount over that 8-year period. And at the end of it, it was 37% higher. The green line, by the way, these three lines stop at different years because my data source, my data sources stopped at different years. The green line is the rents for the entire county, the median rent for the entire county. And indeed, that amount has been going up. Rents have been going up in Allegheny County, but not nearly as fast as the amount of money landlords are asking for in eviction cases. And the reason for that turns out to be that if you just look at the rents that are being paid by the defendants in eviction cases, those are going up much faster than rents overall. And if we just stop for a minute and think about what that means, the people who are involved in eviction cases are, on average, not everybody, but most of those people are renting at the lower end of the market. They're lower income tenant, usually, not everybody, but on average, they're renting at the lower end of the market, they're lower income. So what this really tells us is that at the lower end of the rental market, where the affordable housing is in Allegheny County, the rents have been rising much faster than for the rest of the market, which basically is another way of saying we are losing affordable housing in the county. This is one way of seeing that. You can actually go look at census data, the American Community Survey census data, and see a similar pattern. So focusing on the low-income tenants in eviction cases, this is the group that we were really most interested in understanding their fate in eviction cases. I should say that the court data doesn't actually say anything about the income of a tenant. Nobody asks you when you go in what your income is, or if they do, it's certainly not recorded in any database anywhere. So the way that we can get at portions of the low-income population in eviction cases or two ways. One is that the amount of rent paid by a tenant is recorded on a docket sheet, on the docket sheet for every case as part of the case. So we can look at the monthly rent, and even though not everybody paying a low rent is low income, there's a high correlation. And the other way that we look at is we look at the landlords, because we can actually find out which landlords, housing authorities, nonprofits, private companies operating HUD subsidized properties. We can look at the cases filed by those landlords who we know are renting to low income tenants. What we find, depressingly, but not at all surprisingly, is that the lowest income tenants who are paying less than $500 a month in rent, this is 2016 data, by the way, represent about 15% of all renter households in Allegheny County, 15%, but 35% here of the eviction cases filed. So they're being filed against at a rate more than twice their portion of the rental market. Or putting it in another way, across the county, for every 100 rental units, occupied rental units in the county, 7 eviction cases are filed every year. If you just look at rental units that are under $500 a month in rent, 16 cases, again, more than twice as many, 16 cases are filed for every 100 occupied units. Now looking from the landlord side, we looked at every case and figured out which landlord was filing the case. That's actually quite a lot of work, and I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that later. But once you've done that work, you can separate out which cases are filed by housing authorities. So we have, here, Housing Authority of the City of Pittsburgh, the Allegheny County Housing Authority, and we have a third housing authority in Allegheny County, the McKeesport Housing Authority. Between them, they account for 15 or 16% of all the cases filed. Those are all subsidized residential housing units. In addition to that, if we were able to identify the companies who either own or manage property-based Section 8. So these are properties where every unit in the property is a subsidized unit. That collection of landlords, just housing authorities plus property-based Section 8, that makes up about 12% of the renter households in the county and 27% of the cases filed. And notice that that does not include any of the tenant-based Section 8. Anybody with a Section 8 voucher who's renting in the private market is represented somewhere in this large blue section, the 73% that's private market. And we also couldn't separate out subsidized, HUD subsidized properties where the subsidy came from LIHTC, low income housing tax credits, because those buildings typically are a mix of some affordable units and some market rate units. And when a landlord of that building files an eviction case, we can't tell whether the person they're filing against is living in a subsidized unit. So we initially did this, separated out all the different landlords in order to be able to see something about the subsidized housing and which cases were being filed against tenants of subsidized housing. But once we did that, we were able to see something else about the distribution of these cases. So it turns out every year there are the same 14, 15, 16 companies, agencies, authorities who file over 100 cases. That ranges from 100 to somewhere close to 1,000 a year, depending on who it is. And those 15 landlords every year account for about a third of all of the cases. So those are the three housing authorities in the county every year, companies, private companies, large private companies managing a lot of HUD subsidized Section 8 properties, and then a number of private companies with large rental portfolios. And the reason that's of special interest, I think, is not only because it tells you something about where the bulk of the cases is, but also it means that if you manage to engage those 15 landlords and offer them some kind of service like the mediation pilot that's currently going on in Pittsburgh, you're able to reach and touch almost a third of all of the cases that are filed in the county every year. If you can change the practices of those plaintiffs, of those landlords, you are having a huge effect on the number of cases and what happens to them, and in particular on the many of the low income tenants. At the other end of the scale, most landlords only ever file one case, certainly only one in a year or one or two. These are a lot of individual mom and pop landlords. They might own one unit or a couple of units, and over 90%, so basically there are about 3,000, a little over 3,000 distinct landlords filing cases every year. And most of them, over 90% of them, are only filing a couple of cases. In fact, most of them only file one case. And between them, that large number of landlords who are just filing one or two cases every year also account for about a third of the cases. So reaching them is a different task, obviously, from trying to reach the 15 landlords who are filing 100 or more cases every year. This is a question of reaching a lot of people who may only ever be in a courtroom once. They don't really know the rules, they don't know the procedures, and they don't know what kind of services are available. So but they're important because they account for a third of the cases. So what do we know about outcomes? The reason I put this little title slide here is there's a lot we know, but there's also frustratingly a lot that we don't know and can't know because it's just not in the data. But let me start first with what we actually do know and have been able to learn. At the county level, if you look at the disposition of cases, so what the judgment is, there's very little variation from year to year. Year after year after year, landlords win 85% of the cases. Some years it might be 84% or 86%, but it's basically the same number every year, 85%. Tenants win less than 2% of the cases every year. And the remainder, which is about 13, 14%, are cases that are withdrawn or withdrawn before they get to the point of a hearing, or settled before they get to the point of a judgment, or dismissed. If they're dismissed, they can always be refiled at a later date. So across the county, if you look at the aggregate outcomes, they're very, very, very uniform every year. But as soon as you look down a little bit lower and dig into the data, it turns out there's a huge amount of variation. Across we have about 42 magisterial districts, different 42 magisterial district judges who hear cases in Allegheny County, who hear landlord-tenant cases in Allegheny County. And when you start comparing them to one another, it turns out they're incredibly different. So the number of cases that are withdrawn or settled before they get to the point of a judgment goes from less than 1% to 36%. The reason I think that's particularly interesting is because it means that even though the law is the law is the law, different judges have a lot of power over the way things go, and judges who really press the landlords who appear before them to make sure that they have all of the documentation they need or withdraw the case, or press them to have more discussions with their tenants can basically force more settlements to happen. And so sometimes when I show this, people say, well, there are different districts in different parts of the city with different housing stock, different types of rental units, different income levels, different kinds of tenants, different kinds of landlords, and that is true. But even when you look at one magisterial district and see what happens after an election when a new judge is elected, you can get a sudden shift in the percentage of cases that get settled or withdrawn. So it really shows you that the judges have a lot of power, which is another avenue for trying to bring about changes in practice and outcome. Similarly, different landlords, if you look at the landlords who file the most cases, there's a huge difference in outcomes. And these are all very experienced landlords who go to court a lot, so they understand the rules. But some of them only win half their cases. If you think about that, what does that mean? So the landlord files a case. It now becomes part of the tenant's permanent court record, and that information is available in the public record forever. But it's not necessarily because they have a good case or because they want to evict the tenant. In at least half the cases, the tenant for sure is not being evicted. So basically, this is a way for the landlord to either collect the rent or put some kind of pressure on the tenant. But whatever it is, it's not actually about eviction. But that has a really high cost for the tenant, because now the tenant's record says that they were part of an eviction case, and tenant screening companies who are hired by landlords will report that regardless of outcome. I went online and looked at the sample reports that a lot of tenant screening companies offer to landlords. And there's a section in those reports that says past eviction cases. And it says so-and-so was involved in an eviction case on this date. It doesn't matter what the outcome was. Maybe the tenant won. It still means that case is becoming part of the tenant's record. So let me... So what happens after the tenant loses the case if the landlord wins? So I'm sure most of the people on this call know, but I'll just explain it just in case anybody doesn't. In Pennsylvania, if the only reason for a judgment against the tenant is overdue rent, so not that the tenant trashed the apartment, not some major breach of lease, not an expired lease, just overdue rent. Even once the landlord wins the case, the tenant has a right to pay all the money that's owed. That means overdue rent plus any filing fees and court costs, attorney fees, and stay. They cannot be evicted if they pay the money that's assessed by the judge. And it turns out 73% of all cases that landlords win fall into that category. So 73% of those cases, an eviction is not going to happen if the tenant pays the full amount of the money judgment. And in the housing authorities, it's actually much, much higher. Housing authorities, 90 to 97% of cases are pay and stay cases. So, and in fact, we know from the housing authorities themselves, we don't know from everybody else, but from the housing authorities, they tell us they hardly ever evict anyone. So filing those cases is a way of collecting the rent. They're not about evicting the tenant. It's just a mechanism that landlords use to collect the rent. It's a mechanism that has a very high cost. So looking at the cost, this is just focusing on the lowest income tenants in housing authority properties. So we have the Department of Human Services in Allegheny County has data that we get from the housing authorities. So we're able to see what percentage of their units fall into each one of these rent intervals. So 17% of all the units in the city and county housing authorities are rented to households paying less than $100 a month. These are obviously the lowest income, most financially vulnerable tenants. 29% of cases filed by those two housing authorities are filed against those tenants. And then, so what happens once the case is filed? Well, obviously, you owed some money. the housing authority goes to court. And now, in addition to the rent you owe to the housing authority, you owe the filing fee they had to pay, you owe the fee for the constable to go out and serve notices. And when we looked at how much extra those tenants end up owing, they end up at the end of the process owing 73% more than they originally owed. And just by comparison, if you look at the whole county, for all eviction cases, on average, that number is 12%. So how many people actually end up being evicted at the end of this process? We have no idea. Court data does not contain the answer to that question. There is no required field anywhere in any of the databases, in any of the data that the court keeps, that says, was the tenant evicted or not? So I'm going to, my last slide, this is a little bit technical, but I think this is really important. My last slide on the findings from the report. So if we knew whether, once a landlord won, whether the tenant actually exercised their option to pay and stay, whether they paid the money, stayed in the apartment, and were not evicted, if we knew that, then we would be able to say a lot about how many evictions happen in the county every year, but we don't know that. There is, however, a mechanism already in existence that should allow us to see that. So in 2003, the courts realized that a lot of credit reporting agencies were pulling public records. They were seeing money judgments against a tenant as a debt, and there was nothing that said whether the tenant had actually paid it or not. So credit reporting agencies were treating every single money judgment against a tenant in an eviction case as an unpaid debt. So in order to give tenants a way to show that they had paid the money, that the debt was cleared, they introduced something called an entry of satisfaction of judgment. It's just a one-page simple document. It just basically says the tenant paid the landlord the money. Unfortunately, when they introduced that mechanism, they made it optional. A landlord can file that form if they want to, if they feel like it, but most don't. It's extremely rare, and almost nobody knows about it. Even landlords, even nonprofit landlords who have a lot, who work with low-income tenants a lot, often just don't even know that this exists. But it's important because if it is filed, then it means the tenant paid the money and was not actually evicted. The debt was cleared and the tenant was not evicted, at least not legally evicted. The tenant can file a request that that form be entered. And once the tenant files a request, it becomes mandatory for the landlord to file the entry of satisfaction. But it's almost never done. Tenants just don't know about this possibility. I want to just mention that there was legislation introduced in the last session of the Assembly that would make it mandatory, but it never got voted on in the end. Maybe it's possible it will be reintroduced and passed in the future. But even without any legislative change, I just want to emphasize this because I think this is really important. Anybody who's working with tenants, or in fact, if you're a landlord or work with landlords, if you encourage them to request that that document be filed, or if they're landlords, if they file it even if the tenant doesn't request it, that could go a long way towards giving tenants a way to prove that they've satisfied the debt. They do not have an outstanding debt related to that eviction case. Okay, so that was the last of my findings. I'm going to go on and talk, I have several about the data, different types of data, how you can get it, and how much effort is required for that purpose. So, court data is public. Almost all court data is required to be public, but it's not necessarily in the public interest for all of the court data to be extremely easy to get access to. You don't really want commercial entities to be able to get a lot of information about individuals involved in court cases. You don't necessarily want to give everybody who wants it tenant addresses, for example, or social security numbers. I mean, it can be misused in all kinds of ways. I should mention, by the way, that credit reporting agencies no longer use eviction data as part of their credit reporting. There was a lawsuit that resulted in their agreeing not to do that anymore. But tenant screening companies still use all that information. So anyway, so the way that the courts have dealt with wanting to make information public, but keep some of it less accessible, even though officially it's public, is to have different levels of access and different ways of storing the data. So statewide, there's an electronic database. It's called MDJS, the Magisterial District Judge System. That database has data which it has almost all the data that you would want to know about an eviction case, landlord tenant case. It's available to the public in bulk. So you can file a request, you get the data in bulk in electronic form, you can put it into your own database and do whatever you need to do to analyze it. Less accessible, or less convenient, I should put it this way, less convenient to access is, there are two other kinds of data. Docket sheets can be viewed online. So a docket sheet for a case has most of the important information about a case. And you can just go online for free to the court website and look at any docket sheet for any case that you want. The problem is you have to look at them one at a time, and you can't download them in bulk. And even less accessible, there's a lot of information which is quite useful and interesting that's stored exclusively as either paper records in an individual courthouse, it's just sitting in the court where it was filed, or as digital images of the paper record, so just a picture of the piece of paper. And to get those, you have to actually contact the court office, the individual magisterial district court office, and request it one by one. You have to say, I would like the complaint form for this particular case. And I want to mention also that, in case you wondered why I didn't talk at all about race, gender, ethnicity, age of tenants in eviction cases, that data is not even collected. It's just not part of what the courts collect as part of the case in civil cases. They're collecting what they need to decide the case, and they don't need that information. So it's impossible using court data to do any kind of analysis that's based on demographics. How do you get access? I put a bunch of stuff here, but basically this is what it amounts to. In Allegheny County, we have a huge integrated database that has lots of data from external sources, including the courts, and that's how I was able to do this analysis. Obviously, most counties do not have that. What you can do, though, is you can file a request with the courts and ask for the electronic data. It costs money, and you have to specify a particular time period, and you have to specify which particular data fields that you want. So you get a snapshot if you do that. It can be a long snapshot. You could ask for 10 years worth of data if you want, but it's one particular time period. There are a few fields that require special approval, to get, like addresses and social security numbers. Mostly, I don't think there's social security numbers. Oh, I'm sorry, most of the time. And then for docket sheets, this is kind of a gray area. Of course, you can just go look at them one by one. It is actually possible to write code that will scrape that data and pull it down into a database, and then you have a database that you can analyze just as if you had made a request to the courts. And the advantage of that is that you can do it repeatedly. You can do it even every single night. So you can update the data. The disadvantage, and this is serious is that the websites are not designed for that. And if there's a lot of code running, doing this kind of scraping the data, it can have really bad effects on the functionality of the website. It can slow it down or make it crash entirely. And with good reason, the courts could really not be happy about that. So there is somebody here in Pittsburgh, Ann Wright at CMU's Carnegie Mellon's Create Lab, who has graciously allowed me to put her name and contact information here. She has written code which is as gentle as possible in its effect on the website and does pull down the data for Allegheny County regularly. And she's been using that to very good effect to help support tenants who are having eviction cases filed against them during the pandemic. And she has offered to provide advice and help. So I strongly recommend, if you decide to go down this path, that the first thing you do is contact her, and she can help you understand what the possibilities are. And just very briefly, this is a list of a bunch of other data that I used. I mean, in order to put the eviction data into context, it helps to know about your rental stock, about which units in your community are subsidized and what kind of subsidies they have, who the landlords are. I also looked at, just to find out what which companies owned which properties. They actually used real estate company websites because they usually advertise what their portfolio is. You can look at the law itself, the Pennsylvania Code and Bulletin, in the guide that I put a link to. There's a second link here. The step-by-step guide to the eviction process has links to all of the law. The AOPC website also has a bunch of other information about individual offices, contact information for them, also things like costs and filing fees. Any form that you might want to file, there's a copy of there. And housing authorities. They have tons of data. I mean, you need a data sharing agreement with them to get it, but sometimes they'll share data, and they have a lot of incredibly useful data about their tenants. So that is the last slide that I have, and I will now stop sharing my screen. So are we back now to, great.
Yes, so we do have some Q&A, but so one of the first questions is, you kind of talked about like a big chunk of those landlords that are filing are, you know, owners and operators of large subsidized properties, whether it's housing authority, whether it's public housing or privately owned project-based Section 8. And then about a third of those who are filing, they're only filing a couple times a year. So for that missing group, or the last, I don't know, third to a quarter, do you have any sort of like notable trends within that in-between group?
No, you know, that's the reason I made the cutoff at 5 is basically to divide the cases into thirds. Basically, you know, so basically what's in that middle third, those are people filing between 5 and 100 cases a year. That's a really big range. Mm-hmm. But, you know, for sure, if somebody's filing 5 cases a year, even just 5, they have a bunch of rental property. They don't just have a duplex with an apartment, you know, next door to them. They have a bunch of units if they're filing 5 units. So I haven't really looked at how within that range of people filing 5 to 100 cases a year, I haven't really looked a whole lot at whether there's anything particularly different about that group, and the answer is I really just don't know. I just don't know. I mean, I expect, you know, they probably look a lot like the average, but I don't know. I haven't looked at like whether they're different. I mean, I should. That's a good idea. So from the next report, when it comes out next year, and it's something of interest would be, so is there a difference between that group and the ones who just own mom and pop landlords? But so far I haven't looked at that.
And then somebody asked about the methodology. Is it relevant to all counties except for Philadelphia? Is this because the data is filed in the same system except for Philadelphia?
As I understand it, it's only Philadelphia that has its own separate system. I mean, they have a housing court. They have their own thing. I think in every other county of the state, the rules are the same. As I understand it, they're exactly the same. So like the guide, that guide that I gave a link to with the rules, that applies everywhere except Philadelphia.
Do you have any policy recommendations based on your findings that you are able to share?
Well, for me, the most, in a way, from looking at the fact that the few landlords who are filing the most cases also intersect a lot with the publicly subsidized housing. And that means there's a huge opportunity to affect a lot of low-income tenants and what happens to them when they're behind on their rent by just engaging those 15 organizations. And that's already being done, like the mediation pilot that you're part of, that's happening in the Pittsburgh area and I guess other places around the state. I mean, that's a perfect example of something you can take that and go talk to the head, to the CEO of a company or the executive director, whoever's in charge of a housing authority. And it only takes engaging the leadership of each one of those organizations. There are only 15 of them, and you can just have a huge effect. So anything that can be offered in a way that targets those organizations, if you can get them to change their practices so that they have ways of dealing with overdue rent other than going to court, that's just huge. And then at the other end of the scale, though, then the other 2/3 of the cases involve almost 3,200 landlords. So I think the other important policy observation is if you really want to affect the whole landscape and not just the publicly subsidized part, then you need to have a way to reach out to small-time landlords who don't necessarily know anything about the court system, haven't necessarily thought about it. When they do go, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what documentation they need. They don't know that there are other alternatives. And the kind of outreach has to be something that can be done in tandem with before you get to the point of an eviction case. When a landlord comes to file a complaint, it's already in a way too late. They're already filing the complaint, and that's on the record forever. So figuring out a way to essentially market other alternatives like mediation to, it's pretty much, you're talking about everybody who owns property in Allegheny County, everybody who might be renting one unit in their duplex in order to help them pay their own mortgage. That's a whole different kind of a thing. It's really important to think about that, I think, to have educational materials and services that are available to people, companies. Another thing, something I haven't spoken about, which I think is really important in Allegheny. So I don't know what the rest of the state is like, but I think it's really important that in Allegheny County, fewer than 5% of cases involve lawyers. So in most places, like New York City, when they introduced a right to counsel, 70% of landlords had lawyers, and they all win, and you think, well, yeah, they have lawyers. In Allegheny County, it's still true that the landlords all win, but it's not because they have lawyers. Mm-hmm. And there's a movement to provide right to counsel, and it totally makes sense. Of course, especially low-income tenants would do a lot better, you would think, if they were provided with counsel. But here's the danger, and I'm not saying that this is something that means there shouldn't be a right to counsel. It's just something that needs to be taken into account. When a tenant loses a case, they become liable not only for overdue rent and filing fees, but also, in most cases, lawyers' fees. And I've looked at the lawyers' fees that are assessed, and they range from $50 to $400 per case. And it basically depends on the company. Each company has their lawyer. There's one company where every single case results in a $400 attorney fee being attached on top of the rent. And so I think here's a concern. Right now in Allegheny County, landlords don't have lawyers. Almost none of them have lawyers. What happens if the tenants start having lawyers? Well, there's a very real possibility that the landlords will then decide they need lawyers as well. And who's going to pay for that? The tenants. So I think any movement to right to counsel has to write something into that requirement that makes it the case that tenants aren't going to end up having to pay for their landlord's lawyers just because they're being provided free right to counsel, right? It doesn't do you a whole lot of good not to have to pay for your own lawyer if, as a result, you do have to pay for your landlord's lawyer. So I think that's a super important policy consideration. It's kind of unintended consequence could be that it would make the whole thing more expensive for everybody, unless the law is written in such a way to prevent that from happening.
Okay, that's a very interesting point. Oh, I'm hearing quite the echo.
Anything else?
Let's see, I'm going to try and mute and unmute myself in hopes that it cuts the echo. So I wanted to talk a little bit around the entry of the satisfaction of judgment. In that process, is that something that has to be done by the landlord? Could it be done by a third-party service provider that maybe paid the arrears on behalf of the tenant, or can a tenant make that declaration on their own?
The landlord has to file the entry of satisfaction. The tenant can file a request that the entry of satisfaction be filed by the landlord. I expect that a third party could help the tenant with that. I mean, the tenant probably has to sign it, and I think there's a small fee for it. I think the reason it's optional, the reason they made it optional is it costs money. It doesn't cost very much money, but it costs some money, and that's why they made it optional. And it costs money for the tenant to file the request. Again, it's not, I don't actually know how much it is, but it's a relatively small amount, but it does cost money. But I think that a third party can go get the form. It's literally, it's a page. It says, I, the tenant, paid the landlord this amount of money, signature line, that's it. Mm-hmm. So advocacy organizations can definitely help make that happen. They just have to tell the tenant, they can download the form themselves. They can give it to the tenant. They can go to the landlord and have the landlord sign it. The tenant doesn't have to sign, the landlord has to sign. It may be that the tenant has to be the one who officially files. I'm not certain, but I believe so.
Okay.
And you can get that form on the court website.
Great, thank you.
I mean, just on the AOPC website, you can download that form.
Okay. And that's the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania
The Administrative Office of the Pennsylvania Courts. One of the links I put in the data section is a link to a place where you can file a request for public data, but that's a part of that whole court website. The report has links to the report has links to stuff like that in it, court websites.
So in looking at the court data, does it give you any indication on who the lawyer representation is for landlords? Are you seeing just a small concentration of landlords representing multiple cases, or were you able to notice any trends in that relationship? Yeah,
I looked at it for 1 year, and in that 1 year, which I think was 2018, of the 5% of cases that had lawyers, half were cases filed by 3 or 4 companies. And then I went and looked at every single one of those cases filed by those 3 or 4 companies. And each one of them uses the same lawyer every time. There's one lawyer who actually works for 2 of the companies. So, and the outcomes were totally different for the different companies. And that also, I mean, just like in general for large landlords, the outcomes are, I mean, these companies just have very different policies in the way that they make use of eviction as a tool, of eviction cases as a tool, not eviction, you know, they're using it to do something. And usually what they're trying to do is not evict the tenant, it's something else. Sometimes it's sometimes they want to evict the tenant, but often it's a tool they're using to get the tenant to pay faster, or to drop a complaint about something that needs to be repaired, or to collect the rent. Anyway, the answer to the question is, within that 5%, half of them are basically 3 or 4 companies.
Interesting, interesting.
And again, I just want to say, each company has its own policy about, or maybe it's even written into the lease, how much the lawyer costs. One company gets $400 for every single case they win that goes to the lawyer. Another one is $50.
And if, you know, a tenant doesn't show or anything like that, it's automatically ruled in favor of the landlord, just to be clear on that.
No.
No?
No. Actually, so there's a difference between other civil cases and landlord-tenant cases. The landlord doesn't win just by showing up. The landlord has to not only show up, but present evidence. And that might seem like, you know, it's still the case that if the tenant doesn't show for the hearing to happen, but the landlord can't just show up and say, well, I'm here, the tenant isn't, I win. The landlord still has to actually present a case. And that's written specifically into the court rules, that it's different from other civil cases.
Okay. Could a legislative rule to limit how long eviction case data stay in a person's record be introduced or passed? So I think legislation has been introduced.
Yeah, so the bill that I mentioned about entry of satisfaction, that the focus of that bill is not that one form. The focus of that bill, that was the bill sponsored by Sarah Innamorato and I've forgotten who from Philadelphia. That bill is about expungement and sealing of eviction case records. And really the intention of the bill is that every eviction case will be sealed unless the tenant turns out to be at fault. And one of the criteria that lets the court decide whether the tenant is at fault is whether they paid the money judgment. And if they did, they're not at fault. That's according to that bill. If a tenant exercises that pay and stay option, they're not evicted, they're not at fault, the record is sealed, and that case cannot be used against them any time in the future. That just becomes not part of the public record. And the way that they can tell whether the tenant has paid is by that entry of satisfaction. So that's why they made it mandatory. That's why that bill makes it mandatory.
Okay, okay. And then, let's see. I think that is, for the most part, the end of our questions, and we have about 2 minutes left. So I just really want to thank Rachel for this really thorough presentation, this really great data and research that definitely has the possibility to be replicated in other communities across Pennsylvania. We have had a few people ask whether or not this presentation will be shared afterwards. We absolutely will be sending out a copy of this PowerPoint presentation along with a copy or with a recording of today's webinar. I had posted a link in the chat so people can go ahead and right away access this report and the document that kind of lays out the eviction process and takes you to the links to help you find where in the law itself outlines that stage of the process. And you know, we look forward to continuing this conversation of, you know, how can we capture the data better, to tell the story better, to really drive smarter policy, to prevent all and every unnecessary eviction, and help stabilize tenants, stabilize landlords, and stabilize communities in the long term. So thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.